right, good afternoon. We are going to start our basically, this is our last chapter before we get ready to take our biology end of course exam, our state test. So the videos on here are probably going to be a little bit longer than normal just because I want to be sure that we cover this information and we understand. So be prepared for a little bit longer section. So this is a combo chapter, so it's a combination of chapters 14 and 15. So we're going to do a little bit of the history of life, and then we're going to go into evolutionary theory. Now, what I typically do with this particular topic is reiterate the fact that I realize that some students are religious. Your religious beliefs are your own, and evolutionary theory can sometimes step on people's toes. So, what I ask you to do is to look at this through the lens of science and try not to bring the religious aspect of it in, because it's not something that I'm going to discuss, because that's not something I feel comfortable doing. But realize that this is the scientific aspects and the research that has gone on to look at the history of life and how organisms have changed over millions of years. So be respectful of others' opinions, and hopefully this gives you a nice kind of an introduction to what actually evolutionary theory is all about. So the first things we're going to do, we're going to do A and B today. So we're going to look at the typical sequences of events for fossilization, and we're going to look at some different methods of dating fossils. Then we're going to look at some of the major events that took place in the geologic time scale. And then tomorrow's video will be some of the older theories of the origins of life, coupled with some of the ones that have changed in the recent history. So, one of the things that you have to understand is, because there were no humans that were there to witness the beginnings of life on Earth, there are several clues as to what kinds of organisms and environments were present. We can look at fossil evidence, we can look at preserved evidence, things in rock formations, and get a general idea and come up with theories, but we'll never actually be able to progress those theories into laws or principles. So if you think about Big Bang Theory, well, we think it happened. There's a lot of evidence for it, but we have no way of saying for certain that it actually happened, because we weren't there to witness it. So if we can't witness it in person, then we have to make a theory. But for the land environments, essentially, we look at the types of rocks. And this is a slide that I typically have to go back and change every few years, because the age of the Earth increases with new kinds of discoveries. But most scientists have concluded that the Earth was literally a molten body when it formed roughly 6.4 million years ago. So think like nothing but lava and volcanoes and very unstable atmosphere. After enough time went by, roughly 500 million years, a solid crust formed on the Earth that is much like the crust that forms as lava cools. So if you've ever seen the lava cooling from an active volcano, think over the entire surface of the Earth is what happened. Now, as far as the atmosphere goes, initially it was very, very unfavorable. With enough time and a slowly developing gravitational field, it did start to evolve, but we don't know exactly what the initial composition was of the early atmosphere. But because of all of the gases that were coming up from volcanoes, they decided that the majority of the atmosphere must have been volcanic gas, which is mostly water vapor, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and carbon monoxide, among many other kinds of toxic components. Now, eventually, and we're still talking millions of years at a time, the Earth cooled enough where that water vapor that was floating around the atmosphere started to fall down to the surface and condense. And thus we had our first pools of water, oceans, rivers, so on and so forth, emerged after that. And there's a very famous line that's kind of one of the components of NASA when we look for life on Earth or life on other planets. Where there is water, there is life. So once water became a thing, well, life started to emerge. So again, this is not something that we can say this happened for certain in this series of events, but we look at the preserved evidence of organisms that are left behind, and that is what we call a fossil. So there's several different types of fossils. I put a few of them up here. So this one down here at the bottom, this dinosaur tracks, along with this one up here, are called impressions. They are things that are left in, they may have been made in soft soil, and then that soil had other layers deposited onto it and was just left undisturbed for a long period of time, and those layers eventually formed into rock. Now with plants, they don't typically survive the fossilization process, so we have to rely on things like impressions to get an idea of what they were like. If you've ever watched Jurassic Park, this is something that they talk about frequently. This is fossilized tree sap, which we call amber. It's a precious stone. A lot of people have jewelry made out of it, and that's another way to look at preserved evidence of previous life. And then you can look at whole organisms. So this is the nautilus shell. And you can also, whole organisms would also include like things like bone and teeth and other things like that. So there's this kind of funny picture in your book where it talks about the steps of fossilization, and it shows an alligator. It's kind of goofy looking, but these are the general steps. And it, like I said, it is on page, I don't know the page number exactly, but for figure 14.2, these are the general steps. It is inherently more complex than what is listed here, but organisms usually become fossilized after they die and are buried in sediment. The sediments build up in layers, and eventually the entire organism is encased in sedimentary rock. Enough time, enough pressure goes by. The soft parts of the body, so skin, hair, fingernails, organs, dissipate, and what's left is the bones and the teeth. But the minerals in those will be slowly replaced, and all the empty space will be filled in, and it essentially turned into stone. And then if enough time goes by, erosion can expose those fossils, or you can just dig them up. Now, if you're really into dinosaurs, you're really into kind of doing this kind of thing, there's an entire field of science called paleontology, where you study fossils. And you'd be surprised at the amount of information you can actually learn from a fossil. Not just how the organism was put together, but what its diet was. If it had sharp teeth, well, it was most likely a carnivore. If it had flat teeth or no teeth, it may have been some kind of an herbivore. Did it have claws? Did it have webbed feet? Did it have a tail? Did it stand up on two legs? Was there evidence of, bone breakage? There's so much evidence that you can actually find from a set of bones. So the other thing is, when we're looking at those bones, we want to know too, how old are they? So there's two methods to go about this. Now, these first two terms kind of go together, and then the second two terms kind of go together. The first one is called relative dating. Basically, you're looking at the age of rocks by comparing them with those in other layers. So the layers underneath them and the layers above them. And that's where we get to what we call the law of superposition. Basically stating that the further down in the ground you go, the older the layers get, and the younger layers are going to be deposited at the top. Now, on the more scientific scale, we have what's called radiometric dating, radiocarbon dating, radioisotopic dating. I mean, there's all kinds of other types of things that you can use, and these are actually looking at radioactive isotopes for certain kinds of elements to measure the age of rock or the age of organic material. When we look at living material, we typically look at radiocarbon dating. Carbon is an element that is found in all manner of life on Earth, so it's something that we can look for. And what they're essentially looking for is how much of that material is left. So we look at the half-life. How much time does it take for half of that original isotope to decay? Now, we looked this up in class the other day. So regular carbon-14, that's the basic carbon element, it has a half-life of 5,730 years. But you'd be surprised at how little of a sample you actually need. They can find out the half life of something from a sample the size of the end of a pen because of our technology advances. So a lot of what we do is using radiometric dating. That gives you a more exact age range than if you were to do it with relative dating. All right. So geologic time scale. When you consider all of the years that the Earth has been present, we call that the geologic time scale. But because of the sheer amount of time that includes, it's better to break it down into smaller sections. So these next terms, they're kind of ranked lowest to highest. So an epoch or an epoch, it's the smallest unit of time and lasting several million years. Then you have periods, so divisions of geologic time that is tens of millions of years. And you've probably heard a few of these, so like Jurassic period, Triassic period, Cretaceous. And then the biggest one is the era. So this is 2 or more periods that last hundreds of millions of years. So the one that we're in now, if memory serves correct, we are in what's called the Cenozoic era. And this encompasses all of human history plus a little bit longer. I'd have to look it up to get the exact dates. But if you just look up the geologic time scale, it can give you so much information. And there's a really good image of one in your book. So there's lots of really interesting events that have happened in the geologic time scale. But one of the things that's kind of the bigger change was going from no animals to tons of animals. And that was pretty much the start of the Paleozoic era, was when we started to see more and more animals diversifying. And in the space of just a few million years, the ancestors to a lot of our major animal groups diversified, and we call that the Cambrian explosion because it happened in the Cambrian era. So, but in the history of Earth, we've had 5 different situations of mass extinctions. And the mass extinction that occurred at the end of the Cambrian era wiped out 60 to 75% of all the living species. And most scientists believe that this was caused due to increased volcanic activity, but there are some other proposed hypotheses for how that actually went about. So the Mesozoic era, during this time, this is where we saw a lot of the ancestors for our modern mammals, but also alongside dinosaurs were the dominant land animals before yet another mass extinction struck the earth and killed all the dinosaurs, which we did talk about briefly in another chapter. There was a big argument about how this actually happened for years until this evidence of the meteorite impact was found between the rock layers of 2 separate periods, and they actually call this the KT boundary. Now, the K and the T mean something, but I don't know what it is off the top of my head. But basically, before that KT boundary, we can find dinosaur fossils out the wazoo. They're everywhere. But then after, there are no avian-based dinosaurs. So, a very distinct layer, and that layer, if memory serves correct, the KT boundary is actually a lot of like diamond dust and asteroid-based materials, which actually provided more, evidence for this happened. All right, the last one that I'm going to talk about today is the Cenozoic era, which is actually the one that we are currently in. But when we talk about the Cenozoic era, we also have to talk about plate tectonics. So at one point, all of the continents were one giant landmass, and we called that Pangaea. And it's got a couple other names, but Pangaea is the one that's mostly accepted. But the plate tectonics, it talks about, and there's plate tectonic theory, talks about the land masses are situated on these large plates that are floating over the surface of the earth. And you can see from this diagram here that there's kind of there's about 7 or 8 major ones, and then there's a bunch of little smaller ones. But as the Pangea started to break up, um, this really did help in the diversification of animals. So they moved apart, and then based on where they were located on the globe, we saw different kinds of environments start to take off. So that's why we see certain animals in the locations that they are in, because when Pangea broke apart, that species evolved to survive in that particular climate. Case in point, here's a good example: lions. There's only one place in the world where lions are found in a natural habitat, and that's in sub-Saharan Africa, in the savanna region. There's no other place in the world that you can find them, because when Pangea broke apart, they were in that particular location, and the environment allowed them to form into an apex predator. So there are lots of situations you can pretty much apply this to any kind of animal or plant, is that they are where they are located because they evolved to a point where they were the most successful in that particular area. Animals or plants that were not successful in that area died off. So that's kind of a real simple explanation of that. Um, this is where we're going to stop for today. There is an assignment that I'm going to post along with this. So if you have any issues, please let me know, and I will talk to you guys later.